Samurai William by Giles Milton, book review. So this is a history book. It's the history of William Adams, who was the first Englishman to land in Japan. And also of interest for people who are interested in this kind of stuff. This is the true story behind the novel Shogun by James Clavell, which was this famous, huge novel about Japan that got made into a miniseries in the 1980s. I'll deal with that novel in a separate review. This is a review of the history, Samurai William. I'll start off this review by just quoting from the book cover, the blurb at the back, because I think actually that gives a good idea of the flavor of this book. Quote, "In 1611, London's merchants received an intriguing letter written by a marooned English mariner named William Adams, who had been living in the unknown land of Japan for more than a decade. 7 adventurers were sent to Japan with orders to find and befriend Adams. It was believed he held the key to exploiting the opulent riches of this forbidden country. But when they arrived, they discovered that Adams had gone native." So, end quote, by the way. Yeah, this is a fascinating history book, and it's told by an author, Giles Milton, who has an eye for interesting detail and an indulgence for interesting digressions, for better or for worse. In my opinion, the title of the book and the little blurb I just read are slightly misleading. Talking about Adams having gone natives or Samurai William. It makes it sound like he's a foreigner who's trying a little bit too hard to fit in. Like that Tom Cruise movie where he becomes a samurai. It's not exactly the case. William Adams was actually technically granted official samurai status by the shogun, but it was more of an honorary title. He didn't really become like a samurai, and nor from this history does it sound like he particularly had any interest in going full samurai. So it's more of a story about exploration, adventures on the high seas, exploring strange and exotic foreign lands, and even has a little bit of a Robinson Crusoe or Treasure Island vibe thrown in. The book begins with a brief account of the first Europeans to land in Japan, which were not actually the English, these were the Portuguese. Then the book goes on a digression to talk about the early attempts to find the Northwest Passage through to Asia. So the Northwest Passage was this legendary seaway that you could get by going north through to Asia. It was mostly legendary, I believe. I don't think anyone ever found a working way there, but it was something that was the obsession of European navigators for quite some time, and this book goes into that for a bit. And then finally, after all that, we finally get to the story of William Adams and the bizarre adventure that landed him in Japan. Now, it turns out William Adams wasn't actually intending to go to Japan, but the strange adventure that ended him up in Japan is half the story right there. So William Adams was an Englishman who was aboard a Dutch trading fleet. The fleet was loaded with weapons, and nobody really knows why, but it's rumored that its real purpose was not trading, but to harass the Spanish and Portuguese colonies in the New World. Nobody really knows, but whatever the real purpose was, it never made it. Instead, the ship just had one disaster after another on the coast of Africa, and then in the New World, there were battles with the Portuguese, the ambushes by hostile natives, and the terrors of navigating the Straits of Magellan, all of which are brilliantly described in this book. Finally, in desperation, the men decide to sail to Japan. This was because they were under the mistaken impression that Japan was a lot closer to the New World than it actually was, a lot closer to South America than it actually was. When they finally do get to Japan, all that is left of the 5 original Dutch ships is just one Dutch ship with Adams and a handful of Dutch men. So they think they're finally safe in Japan after this disastrous journey, but unfortunately, they're not safe. Their troubles are just beginning, because it turns out that the Portuguese priests are already established in Japan. And the Portuguese priests are horrified that Protestants are now on Japanese shores, because this was during the time of all the wars between the Protestants and the Catholics. So the Portuguese priests try to use their influence in Japan to have William Adams crucified. That is, until William Adams becomes a friend and confidant of the all-powerful Tokugawa Ieyasu. After which the tables turn, and now Adams is able to use his influence with at the court of the shogun against the Spanish and the Portuguese. Then the narrative changes yet again. And the book goes into the adventures of the British East India Trading Company, which has heard rumors that there's a marooned English mariner in Japan with great influence in the Japanese court. And they want to use him, they want to contact him to use him to set up an English trading post in Japan. And then once again, getting there is half the adventure. And the author Giles Milton guides us through all the exotic adventures in the strange land that the crew has before finally arriving in Japan and making contact with William Adams. Now, from this point on, the book is not so much the story of William Adams. It's a book about the British trading outpost in Japan, which includes the story of William Adams, but here we kind of follow from here on out, we follow the whole story of the British trading outposts, which includes all the adventures, misfortunes, squabbles, personal rivalries on the British trading posts, and the romantic affairs of the British men stationed out in Japan and the disasters that some of those romantic affairs led to, and the at times tense relationship that this trading outpost has with William Adams, who William Adams had already established himself in Japan by this time. It's a fascinating little story. And this takes place in that brief interlude after Europeans discovered Japan, when Japan was still open to European traders, right? So, I mean, if you know anything about Japanese history, you know that Japan is most famous for having closed itself off to European traders in the outside world for 200 years. But this is right in that brief period before Japan closed itself off, when the Europeans were just beginning to establish a foothold here. So it's a fascinating little episode in history. It's fascinating to see how the conflicts from Europe were carried all the way over to Japan. I was already mentioning the conflicts between the Protestants and the Catholics. Now, both the English and the Dutch are Catholic countries. So throughout much of this story, the Dutch and the English are allies. But eventually, trading rivalries lead to war. I think this was the Anglo-Dutch War, which was happening back in Europe. And this spilled again over into Japan, and as it turned out, this was much to the misfortune of the English in Japan, because they were outnumbered and outgunned by the Dutch, who had much more resources in Japan. And it was much to the annoyance of the Japanese, who resented having to police a war between the English and the Dutch on their soil. Now, the author here, Giles Milton, is actually British, and he portrays this whole thing as an act of unprovoked aggression by the Dutch. I don't know. Maybe he's right. I don't know if a Dutch historian might have a different view of it. Another interesting little thing in this book is the rise and fall of Christianity in Japan, which is another theme. So at the very beginning, the Japanese are actually welcoming Christianity and encouraging Japanese people to convert to Christianity because they think it will bring in more European traders. But then after they decided that they don't want the European traders, then Christianity becomes outlawed and the Christians in Japan are persecuted. And there are some sections in this book of very cruel persecution that Japanese Christians suffered. It's shocking, really. In my initial review of this book, I wrote, boy, if you thought the Romans were cruel, like the Roman persecution of Christians, they've got nothing on what the Japanese did to the Christian converts. Then I calmed down a little bit and I thought about it, and I thought, actually, religious persecution has happened in every country, everywhere, at some time or another. Not all at the same time, but at some time or another. So actually, maybe the Japanese, it's unfair to say that their persecution of Christians was exceptionally cruel. There were cruel instances throughout history at various countries. But it is very sobering to read about the cruel things that Japan did to the Christians, the Japanese Christians, after Christianity fell out of favor. I really enjoyed this book. All in all, a lot of fascinating stories. I was reading some reviews of this book on Amazon, by fellow reviewers. And some people have criticized this book for having a selective view of history and for only focusing in on interesting stories rather than a larger historical background. And that's true. That's completely true. But it's equally part of the charm of this book. So Milton is an author who is never afraid to follow an interesting digression, even if it has very little to do with his larger story. For example, we are treated to the story of Captain John Saris and the embarrassment that his stash of pornographic pictures caused to the East India Trading Company. Or the story of Captain William Keeling and his attempts to smuggle his wife onto his ship with him. And a whole bunch of other completely pointless digressions, but interesting digressions. So if you like an author who's not afraid to just go off on a digression every now and again just because it's interesting, you'll enjoy this book. If you're looking for a more tightly focused academic history, then this book probably isn't for you.